The mathematics and architecture of the stitch. The fundamental absurdity of the string. Consider the humble piece of string. In its natural, undisturbed state, it is a one-dimensional object. It has length, but practically speaking, it has no meaningful width and no meaningful depth. It is a line. It is merely a concept of extension. Now, consider the human body. The human body is a lumpy, wildly unpredictable three-dimensional landscape consisting of bulbous curves, sharp 90-degree angles, fleshy protrusions, and constantly moving joints. The rational mind must ask a very simple, yet deeply troubling question. How does a single, unbroken, one-dimensional line transform into a structurally sound, three-dimensional, perfectly form-fitting casing for a human torso? The answer is topological witchcraft. Society has historically draped the act of knitting in a thick, suffocating veneer of domestic docility. The cultural imagination immediately conjures a gentle grandmother, perhaps sitting in a rocking chair by a fire, accompanied by a basket of pastel yarn and a sleeping cat. This image is a spectacular deception. Beneath the soft wool and the rhythmic, seemingly mindless clicking of needles lies a brutal, mathematically rigorous discipline. Knitting is not merely a cozy craft used to pass the time. It is the physical manipulation of spacetime. It is the act of forcing a continuous linear filament into a rigid, engineered matrix of interconnected loops, creating a fabric that can stretch, bend, and support weight, all while maintaining its fundamental structural integrity. To understand the sheer audacity of this, one must compare it to weaving. If one were to snip a single thread in a woven piece of cloth, the fabric would largely remain intact, held together by the massive friction of hundreds of intersecting warp and weft fibers pushing against one another. Weaving is a grid. It is stable. But if one were to drop a single live stitch in a knitted garment, the entire architecture could catastrophically fail. Because the yarn is never cut, and because the entire structure relies on one loop holding the next loop hostage, a single failure causes the piece to unravel sequentially until the complex three-dimensional manifold reverts entirely back into a limp, one-dimensional puddle of string. The entire garment is a live, precarious system. What exactly is happening inside the human brain when the hands execute this translation? How does the mind hold the spatial geometry of a sweater, predicting how a loop made at the collarbone will affect the drape of the fabric at the waist? And more importantly, who were the original architects of this complex spatial code? To fully comprehend the sheer scale of the mathematics involved in making a simple winter accessory, one must look past the yarn and peer directly into the fundamental reality of the stitch itself. One must look at the code. The original binary code. 0, 1 knit purl. Modern human civilization is built entirely upon a foundation of zeros and ones. The digital age, the internet, the software running global financial markets, the algorithms dictating communication, all of it relies on a binary system of true and false. It is an electrical current, either passing through a microscopic transistor or being stopped in its tracks. Long before the silicon chip existed, long before the invention of the microprocessor, and long before the concept of electricity was harnessed, human beings were already writing executable code using a binary system. They were simply using pointed sticks and animal hair instead of silicon and electricity. All of knitting, no matter how breathtakingly complex the final garment might appear, is built upon only two fundamental physical actions: the knit stitch and the purl stitch. In a knit stitch, the active loop of yarn is brought forward through the previously established loop, creating a smooth, flat shape on the front of the fabric that resembles the letter V in a purl stitch. The active loop is brought backward through the previous loop, creating a raised, horizontal bump. This is an absolute binary state. The loop is either pulled to the front or it is pushed to the back. There is no middle ground. It is 0 and it is 1. When a modern fiber artist sits down to follow a complex lace pattern, they are not merely making something pretty to wear against the cold. They are acting as a human central processing unit. They are executing an algorithm. A standard knitting pattern reads exactly like a computer program, utilizing the exact same logic structures. The knitting needles serve as the active storage, holding the array of data points, the individual stitches, in temporary memory. The ball of yarn is the free memory, the raw material waiting to be processed into data. The knitter's hands are the read-and-write head of the machine, moving sequentially down the line of code, processing each stitch according to the strict instructions provided by the pattern. In the realm of computer science, programmers rely heavily on loops to execute repetitive tasks efficiently. A while loop tells a computer to continue performing a specific action until a certain condition is met. A knitting pattern that instructs the creator to knit to the end of the row, or continue in the established pattern until the piece measures 10 inches, is a flawless physical execution of a while loop. Programmers also use nested loops, where a smaller loop operates inside a larger loop. A common ribbed knitting pattern, for example, instructions dictating to knit 2 stitches, purl 2 stitches, repeat that small sequence until the end of the row, and then repeat that entire row sequence for 10 total rows, is a textbook nested loop. It is an algorithm dictating a specific, mathematically predictable output. The women who developed the first complex lace patterns centuries ago were early data analysts. They were writing nested loops, debugging their work when a physical error occurred, and executing code generations before the first mechanical computers were ever conceptualized. When a knitter realizes they made a mistake 30 rows back, they do not throw the item away. They perform an operation known as tinking, which is the word knit spelled backward. They literally reverse engineer their own physical code, pulling the yarn out stitch by stitch, tracing the error back to its source, fixing the logic flaw, and recompiling the program. The Turing machine made of wool. The parallels between knitting and computing are not merely poetic metaphors dreamt up by enthusiasts. They are mathematically provable realities. In the mid-20th century, the pioneering mathematician Alan Turing proposed the concept of a theoretical machine that could compute anything that was fundamentally computable. This theoretical Turing machine required a tape of infinite length divided into discrete cells, a head that could read and write symbols on that tape, and a set of finite rules dictating how the head should move based on its current state and the symbol it just read. Computer scientists have rigorously analyzed the mechanics of hand knitting and determined that the craft is, in the strictest mathematical sense, Turing complete. This means that the physical act of knitting possesses the computational power to simulate any computer algorithm. The active knitting needles function as the tape and the storage mechanism. A needle with a pointed tip on one end and a stopper on the other acts as a standard computing stack, adhering perfectly to the last in, first out data processing principle. A double-pointed needle, which can be worked from either end, acts as a double-ended cue. By utilizing these simple tools, a human knitter can perform any arbitrary calculation that a modern desktop computer can perform. A person could, theoretically, knit the underlying code of a digital operating system, provided they had an infinite supply of merino wool and a lifespan stretching into eternity. This is not entirely a theoretical exercise confined to academic papers. In the early 2000s, a group of artists, communication scholars, and activists collaborated on something called the Viral Knitting Project. They took the exact binary sequence of the code red computer virus, a highly virulent piece of digital malware that exploited vulnerabilities to cripple computer networks worldwide, and directly translated its zeros and ones into a sequence of knit and purl stitches. They then physically knitted the computer virus into a scarf. The resulting object was soft, warm, and highly wearable, yet it held the exact algorithmic instructions to execute a massive digital catastrophe. It was a latent digital threat made physical, ready to be transported across borders undetected. A similar, equally alarming project resulted in the Stuxnet, SDUCKSnet, scarf. Stuxnet was a malicious computer worm, widely considered the world's first true cyberweapon, explicitly designed to sabotage Iranian nuclear facilities by causing their industrial centrifuges to spin out of control and tear themselves apart. The code was incredibly sophisticated, and yet, fiber artists took that exact, highly classified, destructive algorithm and embedded it into the fabric of a winter accessory. The knitter, operating as a human processor, compiled the cyberweapon stitch by stitch. The scarf was entirely harmless to wear, but if one knew how to read the knits and purls, one could theoretically type the pattern back into a computer terminal and unleash international sabotage. The grandmothers of espionage. Because knitting is inherently an act of data encoding, it is the absolute perfect vehicle for steganography, steganography, the ancient practice of concealing a secret message within an ordinary, non-secret medium. During periods of global conflict, the seemingly innocuous, deeply gendered nature of women's domestic textile work provided the ultimate cover for international espionage. During World War I and World War II, the clicking of knitting needles was ubiquitous across Europe and America. Women knitted socks, balaclavas, and heavy sweaters for the troops suffering in the freezing trenches on the front lines. It was considered a basic patriotic duty. But for a select few covert operatives, the yarn was not meant for warmth. It was a weapon of intelligence gathering. Consider a Belgian grandmother during the First World War, sitting peacefully by a window overlooking a bustling railway yard. To the casual observer, or to the occupying German forces patrolling the streets outside her home, she was simply an elderly woman engaging in a harmless, traditional hobby to pass the time. In reality, she was a highly trained operative for the Belgian resistance. As a troop train chugged past her window, she would execute a specific purl stitch, creating a noticeable bump in the fabric of the garment. If an artillery train passed a few minutes later, she might execute a yarn over, intentionally dropping a stitch to create a small, distinct hole in the otherwise solid fabric. She was logging data. She was writing a real-time intelligence report directly into the architecture of a sweater. Once the garment was complete, she would casually hand it over to a fellow operative, who could read the binary sequence of the bumps and holes to precisely track enemy troop movements and supply lines. This textile craftivism was widespread and highly effective. Phyllis Latter Doyle, Phyllis Latour Doyle, a British spy operating under the covert code name Paulette, famously parachuted into occupied Normandy with her knitting supplies securely in tow. Riding a bicycle through heavily guarded enemy territory, she covertly gathered intelligence and encoded the data into the physical structure of knitted beanies and scarves. The system was so brilliantly mundane, so completely cloaked in the assumption of feminine harmlessness, that it was almost entirely invisible to the male-dominated military authorities. The threat of knitted code was eventually taken so seriously by the American government that the Office of Censorship completely banned the mailing of all knitting and crochet patterns overseas during the Second World War. The intelligence community realized, to their horror, that their censors could not distinguish a legitimate pattern for a baby blanket from a highly sophisticated cryptographic cipher detailing naval fleet locations. Both documents consisted of dense, repetitive instructions alternating between two states. Both were, at their core, algorithms. The only way to ensure security was to ban the algorithms entirely. The bridge between women's textile work and modern computing hardware was solidified decades later during the Apollo space missions. To send humanity to the moon, the Apollo guidance computer required a memory system that was physically indestructible, immune to cosmic radiation, and capable of functioning perfectly in the harsh vacuum of space. Standard magnetic tape would be destroyed. The solution was core rope memory, a system so delicate and complex that it could not be manufactured by machines. It had to be woven entirely by hand. Women, utilizing the ancient, binary skills of the warp and the weft, sat at specialized workstations and manually threaded hair-thin copper wires through tiny magnetic rings. If a woman passed a wire through a ring, it represented a 1. If she bypassed the ring, it represented a 0. Through this tedious, manual labor, they literally wove the software that calculated the lunar descent. The male engineers affectionately, and perhaps somewhat patronizingly, referred to it as the little old lady memory system. Before the advent of modern desktop machines, the word computer was a job title, not an object. And the vast majority of those computers were women, executing tedious, mathematically rigorous data storage using the fundamental techniques of the textile arts. The cognitive science of the stitch. If a knitting pattern is a computer program, then the human brain is the motherboard attempting to process an astonishing amount of simultaneous data. The act of translating a one-dimensional string into a three-dimensional object requires a highly specific type of cognitive processing known as spatial reasoning. Spatial reasoning is the brain's ability to mentally visualize, rotate, and manipulate objects in three-dimensional space. When cognitive psychologists measure spatial skills in a laboratory setting, they often use a classic test known as a mental rotation task, originally developed by Shepard and Metzler in the 1970s. Imagine looking at a two-dimensional picture of a complex, blocky shape constructed of cubes. Now, imagine looking at a second picture of a similar shape, but rotated by 60 degrees on its axis. The test subject must quickly determine if the two shapes are identical, just viewed from different angles, or if they are mirror images of one another. This is a rigid spatial transformation. The object moves in space, but its fundamental structure, the arrangement of the blocks, remains absolutely identical. Knitting, however, demands a far more complex and taxing cognitive load. It requires non-rigid or ductile spatial thinking. The knitter is not rotating a solid block of wood in their mind. They are manipulating a hyper-flexible, continuously changing medium that has no inherent structure. The brain must hold a mental model of the final, three-dimensional shape, a sweater, for instance, while simultaneously tracking the current position of the yarn, the physical tension of the loop, and the exact location of the needle tips in space. Furthermore, as every new row of stitches is added, the topology of the object fundamentally changes. It grows, it warps. The brain must accurately predict how a structural manipulation made on row 10 will affect the drape, the stretch, and the fit of the fabric 50 rows later. It is spatial reasoning with the added dimension of time. Research indicates that the constant, repetitive engagement in this complex spatial puzzle actually rewires the neural pathways of the knitter's brain. The multisensory engagement, the tactile feedback of the wool against the fingertips, the visual recognition of the developing pattern, the rhythmic, bilateral motor coordination of both hands moving in concert, creates a state of what neuroscientists refer to as cognitive diversity. When a knitter executes a complex lace or cable stitch, several lobes of the brain must fire simultaneously, stimulating the connections between nerve cells responsible for advanced problem-solving, working memory, and sustained attention. This intense neurological workout has profound psychological effects. Because the knitter is constantly problem-solving, analyzing variables, and debugging their own physical code, the brain is flooded with a sense of self-efficacy. Unraveling a mistake and reknitting a section is not processed by the brain as a failure, but as a systematic, controllable backtracking exercise. The repetitive, forward-moving nature of the craft forces the brain to focus entirely on the next stitch, the next row, the next measurable goal. For individuals suffering from severe anxiety, trauma, or even intrusive, ruminative thoughts, the absolute cognitive demand of tracking the spatial geometry of the yarn leaves the brain with no available processing power to sustain the negative neural loops. Betson Corkhill, a researcher who has extensively studied the therapeutic benefits of knitting, notes that the craft can be more effective than pharmaceutical interventions in rewiring entrenched negative neural pathways. In one study involving women admitted to a specialized unit for anorexia, over 70% reported feeling less fear and anxiety while knitting. The brain cannot simultaneously panic about the future and calculate the trajectory of a ductile spatial transformation. The stitch forcibly overrides the panic. It is a biological override switch executed entirely via sticks and string. Topological witchcraft and the geometry of the foot. Nowhere is the mathematical sorcery of knitting more evident than in the construction of a simple sock. The human foot is an anatomical nightmare to close. The leg descends from the knee as a relatively straightforward, tapering cylinder. It is logical, it is manageable. But then, without warning, the heel juts out aggressively at a sharp 90-degree angle, followed immediately by the long, flat, asymmetrical wedge of the foot. When a tailor weaves a piece of fabric, they are creating a flat, two-dimensional sheet. To make a sock out of woven cloth, one must cut the fabric into several odd, geometrically incompatible shapes and stitch them together, creating bulky, rigid, and ultimately uncomfortable seams right at the points where the foot experiences the most friction and pressure inside a shoe. But a knitter does not cut the yarn. A knitter engineers the fabric to bend space around the heel without ever breaking the continuous line of the string. How is it physically possible to force a straight, seamless tube to suddenly turn a right angle, balloon outward, and then seamlessly revert back into a tube? The answer is a brilliant piece of spatial geometry known as the short row. To understand the short row, one must envision the process of knitting a flat circle by working around and around the edge of a continuous tube. To create the pocket for the heel, the knitter suddenly stops halfway across the row. They do not finish the circle. Instead, they turn the entire piece of fabric around, perform a highly specific, mathematically calculated wrapping maneuver with the yarn to prevent a gaping hole from forming, and knit back exactly the way they came. They are deliberately adding extra rows of fabric only to one specific half of the tube. By mathematically staggering where these turns occur, knitting fewer and fewer stitches on each successive pass, and then gradually knitting more and more stitches, the knitter creates a three-dimensional wedge out of thin air. The fabric balloons outward, curving back on itself, forming a perfectly sculpted, seamless pocket designed to cradle the bulbous extrusion of the human heel. This is not just clever tailoring. It is advanced topology. Elisabetta Matsumoto, Elizabetita Matsumoto, a physicist who studies the geometry and mechanical properties of historical textile techniques, notes that the math required to accurately determine the curvature of a sock heel is astonishingly similar to the mathematics used in Albert Einstein's theory of relativity to describe the curvature of spacetime. When a knitter executes a short row, they are intentionally introducing a deliberate mathematical defect into the fabric. In the realm of physics, when the structural lattice of a crystal is altered, it is known as a dislocation or a disclination. A dislocation occurs when a completely new row of material is added to a matrix, forcing the surrounding structure to warp, stretch, and accommodate the extra mass. A disclination occurs when the fundamental curvature of the object changes direction. Matsumoto points out that this exact phenomenon is what occurs on the skin of a zebra. Where the animal's girth expands around its belly, a dislocation occurs in the pattern, and a new stripe is introduced to cover the extra surface area. When a knitter turns a heel, they are manually forcing a dislocation into the stitch lattice. They are deliberately warping the local spacetime of the sock to accommodate the sudden, strange anomaly of the human ankle. The knitter is operating as a practical physicist, working out equations of non-Euclidean geometry on 4 tiny double-pointed needles, often entirely by feel, while watching television. The accidental Möbius strip. Occasionally, this casual manipulation of spatial geometry goes horribly wrong, resulting in true topological witchcraft. When a knitter sets out to create a seamless tube, such as the neck of a sweater, a hat, or a cowl, they must cast a long row of stitches onto a flexible circular needle and join the two ends together to begin knitting in the round. The cardinal rule of circular knitting, printed in bold, frantic text on nearly every pattern, is: make sure the stitches are not twisted. If the knitter suffers a momentary lapse in concentration, or perhaps a lapse in spatial reasoning, and allows the bottom edge of the cast-on row to twist by exactly 180 degrees before joining the circle, they have committed an irreversible act of mathematical sabotage. By connecting the twisted ends, they do not create a standard, three-dimensional cylinder. They create a Möbius strip. A Möbius strip is a non-orientable mathematical surface with only one continuous side and one continuous boundary edge. It is a paradox made real. If an imaginary ant were to walk along the surface of a Möbius strip, it would travel along both the inside and the outside of the loop without ever crossing an edge, eventually returning to its exact starting point. When a knitter accidentally creates this geometry, the resulting fabric defies all logic. As they knit round and round, the pattern will spiral endlessly into itself. The right side of the fabric will seamlessly, inexplicably merge into the wrong side. The knitter is trapped in an infinite, one-sided loop of their own making. Short of literally cutting the fabric with scissors, or perhaps resorting to actual dark magic, the only solution is to rip the entire project apart, unravel the yarn back to a one-dimensional string, and rebuild the geometry from scratch. The universe of the yarn is absolutely unforgiving. It obeys the laws of mathematics even when the human brain fails to grasp them. The gadgets of speed and the biological cost. Executing these complex, Turing-complete algorithms stitch by stitch is an incredibly slow, laborious process. In the modern era, hand knitting is largely a leisure activity, pursued for pleasure or mental health. But for centuries, it was a vital, cutthroat commercial industry. Before the widespread mechanization of the textile industry, professional hand knitters had to produce goods at a blistering pace just to survive. They could not afford to execute one stitch at a time in a leisurely manner. They needed to optimize the hardware. They needed to invent a tool that would bypass the limitations of human wrists and turn the human body into a high-speed manufacturing plant. Enter the traditional Shetland knitting belt, also known in the local dialect as the Mackin belt. The Shetland Islands, a rugged, wind-whipped archipelago located where the freezing North Sea violently meets the Atlantic Ocean, possess a rich knitting history dating back to the 14th century. The survival of the islanders depended heavily on the mass production and export of complex knitted garments, particularly their famous colorwork sweaters and delicate lace shawls. To achieve maximum efficiency and output, the knitters developed a highly specialized piece of equipment. The Mackin belt is a sturdy leather pad, firmly strapped around the knitter's waist like a utility belt. The pad is punctured with several small holes and heavily stuffed with washed upholstery horsehair. The mechanics of the belt are an exercise in brilliant, albeit brutal, ergonomic engineering. The knitter uses extra-long, double-pointed steel needles, sometimes reaching up to 16 inches in length. They take the right hand needle and jam the blunt end violently into one of the holes in the leather pad, pushing it deep into the dense, unyielding matrix of the horsehair. The needle is suddenly immobilized. It becomes a rigid, fixed pivot point anchored directly to the knitter's core body weight. By completely securing the right needle to their abdomen, the knitter frees up their right hand entirely. The hand no longer has to grip the stick to keep it from falling. It only has to manage the tension of the yarn. The knitter then utilizes a technique known as lever knitting or pivot knitting. The left needle rapidly feeds the live stitches onto the rigid right needle, while the free right hand whips the yarn around the tip at terrifying speeds. The action requires only microscopic, highly calibrated twitches of the fingers, rather than sweeping, exhausting motions of the wrists, elbows, and arms. The knitter effectively transforms themselves into a human sewing machine. Historical accounts from the islands note that proficient Shetland knitters could walk across the rocky terrain, carry heavy loads of peat for the fire, and even cook meals over an open flame, all while maintaining a blistering knitting speed, the long steel needle jutting out from their waist like a specialized biological appendage. However, functioning as a high-speed mechanical processor extracts a severe, undeniable toll on the frail human body. The physical reality of knitting microscopic lace for 14 hours a day by the dim, flickering light of a peat fire is not a romantic pastoral fantasy. It is an orthopedic and ophthalmic nightmare. Modern medical researchers studying computer vision syndrome, the debilitating digital fatigue that plagues modern office workers staring at glowing screens, have noted that the symptoms are virtually identical to those suffered by historical lace knitters. When the human eye focuses intensely on a tiny, repetitive spatial grid for hours on end, attempting to differentiate between threads thinner than a human hair, the orbicularis oculi, orbicularis oculi, muscle goes into crisis. This is the sphincter muscle responsible for closing the eyelids. Under extreme, sustained visual demand, the muscle goes into a state of continuous contraction. Blood flow to the muscle is severely restricted, leading to localized ischemia and profound, throbbing pain. The historical knitters suffered from chronic dry eye, blurred vision, and agonizing tension headaches radiating from the optical nerve down through the cervical spine. Furthermore, the extreme postural strain of hunching over fine gossamer threads resulted in permanent musculoskeletal deformation. The knitters were sacrificing their own biology to produce the code. Being the human hardware for a textile algorithm was a severe occupational hazard. The wedding ring test and the Orenburg gossamer. Why would a human being willingly subject their body and their eyesight to such grueling, agonizing conditions? Because the resulting physical output is one of the most astonishing feats of material science on the planet. This brings the investigation to the absolute pinnacle of topological witchcraft, the legendary wedding ring shawl. Imagine a standard gold wedding band. It is a small, rigid circle of metal, barely 3/4 of an inch in diameter. Now imagine a heavy, intricately patterned, square blanket measuring over 6 feet on each side. The rational mind entirely rejects the possibility that the massive blanket could pass through the tiny metal ring. The basic physics of volume and compression dictate that the fabric would bunch up, jam against the metal, and ultimately tear if forced. Yet in two specific, geographically isolated regions of the world, the Shetland Islands of Scotland and the Orenburg region of the Russian Ural Mountains, artisans have spent centuries engineering shawls so mathematically precise and spun from fibers so microscopically thin that the entire massive garment can be pulled smoothly through a wedding ring without snagging a single thread. How is this physical impossibility achieved? It begins at the cellular level, with the biology of the animals involved. The Shetland sheep, a hardy breed native to the North Atlantic, possesses a unique double coat designed to withstand freezing gales. The outer coat is coarse and weather-resistant, but the inner coat, particularly the fibers harvested from the throat and neck of the sheep, is exceptionally fine and soft. When these specific fibers are isolated, they can be spun into a single-ply yarn of gossamer thinness. But to find the absolute extreme of microscopic fiber, one must travel to the punishing, wind-scoured steppes of the southern Ural Mountains, to the goats of Orenburg. The Orenburg goat has evolved to survive brutal, unforgiving winters. To insulate its body against the lethal cold, it produces a down undercoat of staggering fineness. In the textile industry, the thickness of an animal hair is measured in micrometers. To provide a sense of scale, a standard human hair is approximately 70 micrometers thick. The down of an average alpaca measures between 20 and 26 micrometers. The down of an Angora goat measures 22 to 24 micrometers. The down of the Orenburg goat measures a mind-bending 14 to 18 micrometers in diameter. It is vastly thinner than a human hair. It is nearly invisible to the naked eye. In the spring, just before the blistering summer heat arrives, the goats naturally begin to shed this down. The local farmers do not shear the goats with clippers. Instead, they meticulously comb the animals by hand, using a highly specialized device made from sharp cobbler's needles set closely together in 2 rows on a wooden frame. This terrifying-looking comb extracts only the microscopic down, leaving the coarse guard hairs behind on the animal. Each goat yields only about a single pound of this precious, cloud-like fiber per year. Once harvested, the down must be spun into yarn. The spinning of Orenburg gossamer is an exercise in extreme tactile sensitivity. The spinner uses a slender, hand-supported spindle that lacks a whorl, the typical weight used to maintain momentum. Because the fibers are only 14 micrometers thick, they have almost no tensile strength on their own. The spinner must draw the fluff out and twist it into a thread, feeling the tension solely through the hypersensitive nerve endings in their fingertips. To give the resulting cobweb enough structural integrity to survive the rigorous knitting process, The microscopic goat down is plied, twisted together, with a single, ultrafine filament of pure silk. The silk provides an unbreakable, rigid skeleton. The goat down provides a halo of incredible warmth and softness. The resulting yarn is so delicate that it feels less like a physical object and more like a rumor of an object. The knitters of the region use this silk and goat down hybrid to construct the Pautinka, the legendary Orenburg spiderweb shawl. The architecture of the Pautinka is a masterpiece of spatial programming. The patterns are rarely written down. They are held entirely in the knitter's memory, passed down verbally and visually through generations of women. The knitter must hold the algorithm in their brain. The classic Orenburg patterns utilize geometric shapes, diamonds, diagonals, and a highly distinctive honeycomb motif. The honeycomb is created by a relentless, mathematically rigid repeating sequence of yarn overs and decreases. As established earlier, a yarn over intentionally creates a hole in the fabric. A decrease intentionally destroys a stitch to maintain the overall stitch count. By charting these holes into precise mathematical grids, the knitter creates a fabric that is mostly empty space. It is a structural matrix constructed of nothing but tiny silk and goat hair bridges spanning across voids. The borders of the shawl are engineered with complex, jagged edging known as teeth, requiring intricate mathematical calculations and short rows to ensure the corners turn perfectly at 90 degrees and lie completely flat. The knitter may have thousands of live stitches on their needles at any given time. Dropping one of those microscopic stitches in the dim light would be a catastrophic structural failure. When the Pautinka is finally complete, the sensory experience of handling it is deeply disorienting. Because the goat down is entirely hollow, it retains massive amounts of heat despite having almost no physical mass. A shawl large enough to cover a human from the shoulders all the way down to the waist might weigh only a few ounces. When draped over the skin, it is described as feeling exactly like the softest of cats, light enough to wear comfortably on a cool summer evening, but warm enough to withstand a sub-zero Russian winter. And then comes the final, absurd test. The vast, geometrically perfect web of lace is gathered into a single point. A standard gold wedding ring is produced. The tip of the shawl is fed through the center of the ring. And then, slowly, the entire 6-foot garment is pulled through the tiny circle. Ow! Because the fiber is only 14 micrometers thick, and because the mathematical algorithm of the lace pattern consists predominantly of engineered holes, the mass of the fabric yields entirely to the compression. The air is violently squeezed out of the honeycomb lattice. The structure collapses flawlessly into a dense, momentary ribbon passing through the gold band, and then immediately, miraculously expands back into its vast, rigid geometric shape on the other side as the wind catches it. The wedding ring test is not merely a clever parlor trick. It is the ultimate physical proof of the mathematics of the stitch. It proves that the knitter has successfully taken a pile of shed animal hair, twisted it into a one-dimensional line, and written an algorithm so structurally perfect that it can warp space, compress its own volume, and emerge on the other side completely intact. The unraveling. To view knitting as a quaint, domestic pastime is a fundamental failure of imagination. The evidence presented in the architecture of the stitch demands a profound, immediate paradigm shift. The simple act of sliding a loop of string onto a stick is, in reality, an entry point into the deepest, most perplexing complexities of binary mathematics, computer programming, cognitive neuroscience, and spatial geometry. The anonymous women who sat by the hearth fires of the Shetland Islands or in the frozen valleys of the Ural Mountains were not simply making blankets to pass the time. They were original hackers. They were practical physicists calculating the curvature of spacetime to perfectly fit a human heel. They were data analysts writing nested loops and executing complex algorithms using primitive memory systems constructed of bone, steel, and horsehair. They spun fibers finer than human hair, tracked thousands of constantly changing variables in their minds, and engineered topological structures that defied the physical laws of compression and volume. They took the absolute chaos of the natural world, the shed down of a goat, the coarse wool of a sheep, and forced it into a rigid, mathematically perfect binary matrix. Knitting is the triumph of the algorithm over the string. It is the ultimate hack of the physical universe, executed flawlessly, one stitch at a time.